My name is Lena Petrova, and I live a life scented with sawdust and lavender. In a small bungalow on the rain-kissed edge of Port Blossom, Oregon, I find and restore forgotten things. Old dressers with peeling veneer, chairs with wobbly legs, writing desks clouded with the patina of age, I sand them down, mend their breaks, and coax the beauty back to their surfaces. My workshop, a converted garage filled with the ghosts of other people's furniture, is my sanctuary. It's where I make sense of the world, piece by piece. My son, Misha, who is 8, says I'm a furniture doctor. I think I'm just a woman who understands that even things that look broken can be made whole again. This quiet, deliberate life is one I built for myself, board by board, after my marriage dissolved into a quiet ache of mismatched expectations. I am a single mother. For a long time, I let those words define me in the way others saw fit, a story of lack, of incompleteness. But here, with the hum of my sander and the steady presence of my son, I was slowly rewriting that definition into one of strength and self-reliance. My family, however, still read from the old, tattered copy. Especially my mother, Irina, and, more recently, my younger brother, Dmitry. I still remember the exact moment the room went silent. It wasn't the kind of hushed reverence that follows a beautiful vow or a sweet first dance. No, it was the kind of silence that clamps down on your chest, a sudden, cold pressure that dares you to breathe. At my brother Dmitry's wedding, his bride stood on a small, elegantly lit stage and, with a smile as bright and brittle as spun glass, called me an inspiration. It was the way she said it, the faint, saccharine pity in her tone, that was the first stone cast. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when my own mother, leaning toward the woman beside her, whispered into the lingering field of a live microphone, "She's like a lovely old book with half the pages torn out. Still pretty on a shelf, but what good is it, really?" And just like that, a ripple of soft, polite laughter spread through the room. It wasn't a roar, it was worse. It was the sophisticated tittering of people who knew they shouldn't laugh, but did anyway, a sound that wrapped around my throat like a scarf woven from shame. I sat there frozen. My hands, usually so steady and capable in my workshop, trembled in my lap. I could feel a hot blush creep up my neck, flooding my cheeks. I reached for my water glass, my fingers fumbling, and then curled them into a tight fist on the crisp white tablecloth, praying no one would notice the tremor. My eyes, against my will, darted to Dmitry at the head table. He was looking down, his handsome face a mask of strained neutrality, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. His gaze flickered toward me once, just a brief, agonizing second, before skittering away as if the sight of me burned him. That tiny flicker of his avoidance, of his silent complicity, gutted me more than the laughter. Suddenly, I was a girl again, standing on the edge of the playground, watching the other children pick teams, knowing my name would be the last one called, if it was called at all. Except this wasn't a playground with strangers. This was my family. And for what? Because I was a single mother? Because my life wasn't encased in the same gilded frame as Anastasia's? Anastasia, Dmitry's bride. She stood on that stage in her gown of ivory silk, a vision of curated perfection. She held the microphone like a scepter, her smile never quite reaching the cool gray of her eyes. For the past year, I'd watched that smile. I'd heard her compliments that felt like carefully veiled critiques. "It's so brave," she'd said to me once over a strained family dinner, "to be doing all of this on your own." She made brave sound like a synonym for pitiable. And then there was my mother, Irina. The woman who once taught me how to find constellations in the night sky now looked at me as if I were a miscalculation in the grand equation of her life. She saw Anastasia, with her family's old money and her flawless social pedigree, as a victory, a correction to the disappointment I represented. Why did her words still have the power to wound me so deeply? After all these years, why did I still hunger for an approval she treated like a scarce and precious commodity? I sat perfectly still, my spine a rigid pole, my lips stretched into a smile that felt like it was cracking my face. Beside me, Misha fidgeted. He clutched a linen napkin, his small brow furrowed. His large, thoughtful brown eyes, so like his father's, searched my face. "Mom," he whispered, his small voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. "Why are they laughing at you?" That innocent question shattered the fragile dam I'd built inside myself. I opened my mouth to reassure him, to say something wise and comforting, but no words came. How do you explain to your child that the people who are supposed to be your safe harbor are sometimes the storm itself? I wanted to flee. To take his small hand, walk out of that opulent ballroom with its suffocating perfume of roses and hypocrisy, and never look back. But before I could even think to push my chair away, Misha did something I will carry with me for the rest of my days. He stood up. There was no hesitation. Just a quiet, resolute straightening of his small frame. He placed his napkin carefully on the table and, with a dignity that seemed far beyond his 8 years, he began to walk toward the stage. I should have known the day would be a gauntlet. The feeling of being an ill-fitting piece had started that morning, standing in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. The dress was a deep emerald velvet I'd found in a vintage store downtown, a place that smelled of cedar and thyme. It had felt like me when I bought it, elegant but not ostentatious, with a history in its seams. But now, under the weight of the day's expectations, it just felt old. Not vintage. Just old. "You look like a forest queen, Mom," Misha had said, appearing in the doorway, his own small suit and clip-on tie making him look both impossibly grown-up and heart-wrenchingly young. I'd smiled, the first genuine smile of the day. "Thank you, my little lion," I'd said, ruffling his hair. "You're my favorite hype man." The drive to the Ainsworth estate, a grand old manor overlooking the wide, gray expanse of the Willamette River, was filled with Misha's quiet humming. "Is Uncle Dmitri nervous?" he'd asked. "Probably," I'd laughed, trying to keep my own nerves from fraying the edges of my voice. "Weddings are a big deal." I didn't say what I was really thinking. Family is a bigger one. Dmitri and I were once an inseparable unit. 5 years my senior, I had been his fierce protector after our father left, a quiet, bewildering departure that had left our home feeling hollowed out. I helped him with his math homework, taught him how to skip stones across the river, and sat with him through thunderstorms that rattled the windows and his composure. For years, it was Lena and Dmitri against the world. Then came Anastasia. She was like a perfectly cut diamond, brilliant, sharp-edged, and impossibly hard. She entered our lives and refracted the light, bending everything toward herself. I tried. I truly did. I invited her to my workshop, hoping she might see the passion in my work, the story in the grain of the wood. She'd glanced around, a polite, vacant smile on her face, and said, "How quaint. It must be so rewarding to have a little hobby." My mother, however, was instantly captivated. I watched as Irina, who had always been so critical and reserved with me, blossomed in Anastasia's presence. She laughed at Anastasia's vapid stories about charity luncheons and sailing regattas, her eyes shining with a pride I had never seen directed at me. I was the daughter who had gotten pregnant too young, whose marriage had failed, who worked with her hands instead of her connections. I was a reminder of life's messy, splintered realities. Anastasia was the promise of a smooth, polished surface. I used to think I was just being too sensitive, that the chip on my shoulder was of my own making. That wedding proved me wrong. The venue was breathtaking. Thousands of white peonies and gardenias spilled from silver urns. A string quartet played softly in a corner, their music a silken thread weaving through the air. Candlelight glinted off crystal glasses and the contented faces of Port Blossom's upper crust. And then there was me, smoothing the velvet of my dress, adjusting the strap of the only pair of heels I owned, and praying Misha wouldn't spill his Shirley Temple on his crisp white shirt. He looked so proud, though. "Do I look official?" he'd asked, puffing out his chest. "You look like the most important man in the room," I'd told him, and I meant it. I had spent hours navigating the social currents, smiling and nodding, making excruciating small talk about the weather and the beautiful floral arrangements. I was surviving. I was holding my head high, even as I felt the dismissive glances from Anastasia's friends, women who looked as if they'd been born wearing pearls. I had been holding it all together, my composure, my pride, the carefully constructed walls around my heart. Then came the toasts, the microphone, and the soft, cruel laughter. Everything I had held so tightly came crashing down around me. And in the echoing silence of my humiliation, I saw something in my son's eyes that changed everything. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was a fierce, quiet fire of protection. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. So he stood up and walked toward the stage. And I, his mother, the one who was supposed to protect him, could only sit there, holding my breath as the whole world watched. My heart didn't just drop, it plummeted, a stone falling through an endless, dark well. I watched Misha's small, determined back as he navigated between the round tables, each step on the polished parquet floor a distinct, terrifying tap. My first thought was one of desperate hope. Maybe he was just going to the restroom. Maybe he was curious about the stage lights. Maybe, please, he would turn around and come back. But he didn't. The whispers started, a low hum that grew as more heads turned. Isn't that her son? What is he doing? Every curious gaze felt like a physical touch, a prod against my raw nerves. I half rose from my seat, one hand outstretched as if I could physically pull him back with the force of my will. Misha, I hissed, my voice a strangled thread of sound. Sweetheart, come back. He didn't falter. He reached the two low, carpeted steps leading to the stage and ascended them with the gravity of a diplomat approaching a podium. The DJ, a young man in a too shiny suit, leaned down, a look of gentle bewilderment on his face. Hey, little man, the stage is for the wedding party right now. But from the head table, Dimitri's voice, tight and sharp, cut through the murmurs. Let him speak. The room fell into a new kind of silence. Expectant. Tense. My son, my sweet, shy boy who spent his weekends building elaborate Lego castles and drawing maps of imaginary worlds, now stood before a microphone. He had to reach up to adjust it, his small hands gripping the cool metal stand as if for balance. He looked so fragile up there, dwarfed by the towering floral arrangements behind him. But the set of his small shoulders, the firm line of his mouth in that moment, he seemed more solid than anyone in the room. Even my mother had put down her champagne flute, her expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. Anastasia, who had been basking in the afterglow of her little performance, turned slowly, her perfect smile tightening at the corners. And then, Misha spoke. His voice, clear and unbroken, carried through the speakers, filling every corner of the vast, silent room. I know something about the bride. The words were so simple, so direct. My blood ran cold. My hands were slick with sweat, my mouth as dry as dust. A frantic prayer looped through my mind. Please, Misha, don't say something you'll regret. Please don't make this worse. Please, please, please. But there was a quality in his voice, a calm, unnerving certainty that held the entire room captive. Anastasia's mask of serene amusement twitched. She leaned forward slightly, her brows arching. What are you talking about, sweetheart? She cooed, but the sound was thin, strained, a porcelain veneer with a crack running through it. Misha didn't look at her. He looked at me, a long, steady look. It was in that gaze that I saw the depth of his understanding. He wasn't just defending me from an insult. He was defending the truth of who I was, of who we were. His expression wasn't asking for permission. It was a simple statement. You taught me to be honest. I'm just doing what you taught me. He turned his attention back to the silent, watching crowd. I heard her talking, he said. Before the wedding started. A collective, soft intake of breath swept the room. It was barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves, but it was there. Anastasia's face was now a study in controlled panic. I couldn't move. It felt as if the floor had dissolved beneath my chair, leaving me suspended in the thick, heavy air of that one single moment. And all I could think was, what did he hear? Misha had been by my side almost all day. He hadn't been with Anastasia, had he? Then, like a shard of glass, the memory pierced my thoughts. Earlier that afternoon, just before the ceremony, the photographer was trying to organize the family photos. My mother had been fussing with Dimitri's tie, and I'd sent Misha to find the men's restroom, which was down a long corridor past the bridal suite. He was gone for 5, maybe 10 minutes at most. An eternity in a child's world. A lifetime in this one. He must have overheard something. The silence in the ballroom stretched until it was as thin and fragile as a soap bubble. No one coughed. No one shifted. It was as if 200 people had forgotten how to breathe. And my son, my little lion, stood at the center of it all, ready to speak a truth that I knew, with a terrifying certainty, would change everything. The world seemed to slow down, the light from the chandeliers softening into a hazy, dreamlike glow. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of 200 pairs of eyes fixed on my small son. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a pivotal scene in a movie, my heart pounding in time with the somber, unseen score. Misha took a small breath, the sound amplified by the microphone, a tiny, human noise in the vast, cathedral-like silence. I was looking for the bathroom, he began, his voice still steady, still clear. He glanced at me again, and I saw a flicker of his own fear, but it was overshadowed by a profound resolve. I gave him the smallest, most imperceptible nod, a signal that said, "I'm here. I trust you." A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek. I didn't bother to wipe it away. The door was a little bit open, he continued, his gaze now fixed on some point in the middle distance, as if replaying the scene in his mind. The one that said, "Bridal Suite." I heard voices. So I stopped. Anastasia shifted in her seat at the head table. Her hands were clenched in her lap, the knuckles white against the ivory silk of her dress. "Dmitri," she murmured, her voice a low, urgent plea. "This is absurd. Make him stop." But Dmitri didn't move. His eyes were locked on Misha, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. "I heard Anastasia talking to her friend," Misha said, and this time he looked directly at the bride. She was laughing. He paused, and in that pause, my stomach twisted into a painful knot. She said she couldn't believe it was all working out so perfectly. She said she was so tired of dating artists and musicians with no real prospects. A low murmur rippled through the guests. I could see faces turning, friends whispering to one another. Anastasia's carefully constructed world was beginning to tremble. She said, Misha's voice grew even more focused, more precise, that she needed someone stable. Someone with a good family name who would give her a beautiful house and wouldn't ask too many questions when she wanted to go on trips with her friends. She said Uncle Dmitri was sweet. That he was so in love with her he'd be too nice to ever say no to anything. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. They landed with a sickening thud in the silence. Anastasia was no longer frozen. She was visibly shaking, a flush of crimson creeping up her neck. "That's not true," she snapped, her voice high and sharp. "He's making it up. He misunderstood." But her denial was frantic, hollow, and nobody seemed to be listening. My own heart was breaking for Dmitri. I risked a glance at him. The mask had shattered. He looked utterly devastated, his face pale, his eyes wide with a dawning, catastrophic understanding. And then Misha delivered the final, crushing blow. He took another breath, and this time, his voice trembled just slightly, infused with the pure, righteous anger of a child. And she said that once they were married, she would have to find a gentle way to phase out the parts of the family that were, embarrassing. He stumbled over the word, as if it tasted foul in his mouth. He looked right at me, his eyes now shining with unshed tears. She was talking about my mom. That was it. The bubble of silence didn't just pop, it imploded, leaving a vacuum where all the air, all the politeness, all the pretense had been. No one gasped. No one whispered. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Misha looked from me, to his uncle, and then back at the silent assembly of guests. "She said my mom was an embarrassment," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a pain that lanced my own heart. "But she's not. My mom is the kindest person I know. She works harder than anyone. She can fix anything. And she never, ever says bad things about other people, even when they deserve it." His voice finally broke on the last few words, a small, hiccuping sob that was the most powerful sound I had ever heard. In that moment, I didn't care about the wedding, the dress, the insults, or the stares. I didn't care what anyone in that room thought of me. Because on that stage, under the glare of the lights, my son hadn't just exposed a lie. He had held up a mirror to the entire room and to me, reflecting a truth about love, loyalty, and courage that no amount of money or status could ever buy. Without knowing it, he had taken the torn pages of my story and, with his own small, steady hands, had begun to piece them back together. The silence that followed Misha's final words was different. It wasn't stunned or shocked. It was solemn. It was the silence of a truth settling, of illusions crumbling to dust. For a long, stretched-out moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then, slowly, Dmitri stood up. He didn't look at Anastasia. He didn't look at the guests. His eyes were only for Misha. He walked to the edge of the stage, his movements stiff, as if he were wading through deep water. "Misha," he said, his voice hoarse, broken. "Come here, buddy." Misha, his duty done, seemed to shrink back into himself, becoming an 8-year-old boy again. He wiped his nose on the back of his hand and walked into his uncle's waiting arms. Dmitri knelt and enveloped him in a hug so tight and long it seemed he was holding on for dear life. I watched them, my vision blurred by a fresh wave of tears, tears of relief, of sorrow for my brother, of an immense, overwhelming pride. When Dmitri finally stood up, his face was a ruin of grief and clarity. He turned, at last, to Anastasia. "Did you say that?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, devastating question from a man whose heart had just been irrevocably broken. Anastasia, now cornered, attempted one last defense. Her face, blotchy with rage and fear, twisted into a pained smile. "Dmitri, darling, please. You can't seriously be taking the word of a child over me. Over your fiancé. It was just silly wedding jitters talk. Girl talk." He twisted it all around. Her voice was a desperate spiral, trying to find purchase on a smooth, sheer cliff face of disbelief. The guests weren't buying it. I saw it in their faces, the pitying looks directed at Dmitri, the cold stares aimed at Anastasia. The tide of opinion had turned, swift and irreversible. Then, from a table near the back, an older woman's voice rose, calm and clear. "I heard it too, Dmitri." Head swiveled. It was Svetlana, my mother's cousin, Dmitri's godmother. A woman known for her quiet dignity and unwavering honesty. She stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. I was resting in the parlor across the hall from the bridal suite. The door was ajar. I heard every word. "The boy is telling the truth." That was the final nail. The air crackled and Anastasia seemed to deflate, all the fight going out of her. The carefully constructed artifice of her life had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes by an 8-year-old boy and a woman who valued truth over appearances. "I asked you," Dmitri whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of his disillusionment. "So many times, I asked you if you were sure, if you really loved me. You looked me in the eye and lied every single time." Anastasia's expression shifted from panic to a cold, hard fury. She opened her mouth, perhaps to lash out, to scream, to salvage some piece of her pride, but no sound came out. She looked at Dmitri, at the faces of the guests now staring at her with a mixture of pity and contempt, and she seemed to make a decision. Without another word, she turned, her back ramrod straight, and walked off the stage. Her heels clicked in angry, staccato rhythm on the polished floor, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the silence. She didn't run. She simply exited. A beat of silence, and then someone began to clap. It was a single, hesitant sound. Then another joined in and another. Soon, the entire room was filled with a steady, rolling wave of applause. It wasn't for the drama. It wasn't for the spectacle. It was for Misha. It was for the small boy who had spoken truth to power, who had stood up for his mother with a courage that shamed every adult in the room. I finally pushed my chair back and went to him. I met Dmitri at the foot of the stage, and, before I could say a word, he pulled me into a hug, mirroring the one he'd given my son. It was a hug freighted with years of unspoken words, of distance, of regret. "Lena," he breathed into my hair, his voice thick with tears. "I am so sorry. For everything. I held on to him, my own tears soaking the shoulder of his tuxedo. I didn't know what the future held for him, for us, for our fractured family. But in that moment, buried in my little brother's embrace, I felt a profound sense of release. The shame had lifted. The weight of their judgment was gone. I felt seen. Truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. Later that night, Misha and I sat in my old station wagon in the nearly empty parking lot. The grand estate glowed behind us, a monument to a fairy tale that had spectacularly imploded. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was slumped in his seat, his head resting against the window, his bow tie undone and dangling from his collar. "Are you okay, my love?" I asked softly. He nodded, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Yeah," he mumbled. Then, after a moment, he added, "Are you?" The question, so simple and so profound, landed directly in the center of my heart. I thought for a moment, letting the truth of it settle. "Yes," I said, and I was surprised by the conviction in my own voice. "I think I'm really, really okay." He was quiet for another moment. "You're not a torn-up book, Mom," he said, his voice drowsy but firm. "You're the whole library." The tears came again, but these were different. They weren't tears of shame or hurt. They were warm and cleansing, like a gentle spring rain washing the world clean. When we got home, I tucked him into bed, smoothing his messy curls back from his forehead. I lingered longer than usual, just watching him breathe, my heart swelling with a love so fierce it felt like it could power a star. "You were so brave tonight, Misha," I whispered. He smiled, his eyes already closed. "You taught me how," he murmured, and drifted off to sleep. In the quiet of the following weeks, the world reformed itself along new lines. Dmitri canceled the honeymoon and began the slow, painful process of untangling his life from Anastasia's. We talked. Really talked, for the first time in years, not as a broken family, but as the two kids who once stood together against the world. The bridge between us, long neglected and weathered, was being rebuilt, plank by plank. My mother sent a single, terse text message a week after the wedding. "I'm sorry things became so dramatic. I hope you're well." It was not an apology, but a dismissal. I read it, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing, not anger, not a longing for more. I just deleted the message and went back to my workshop. I no longer needed her validation to know my own worth. People say weddings are about celebrating a union, a new beginning. That one, for me, was about an ending. It was the end of my quiet acceptance of other people's narratives. It was the end of believing that my value was something that could be conferred upon me by a man, or a mother, or a social circle. That night, I didn't lose my dignity. I found it, reflected in the brave, clear eyes of my son. In my little workshop, surrounded by the scent of wood and wax, I pick up a piece of reclaimed oak, its grain deep and complex. I run my hand over its surface, feeling the knots and imperfections that tell its story. It isn't flawed. It's strong. It's beautiful. And it's whole. Just like me.